This $49 IEM produces a wonderful soundstage, excellent imaging and separation, but it's not all perfect, so let's have a chat about it and find out why. The ikko OH300 here is a $49 IEM using a 10mm dynamic driver. It's got an impedance of 30 ohms and a sensitivity of 107 decibels per milliwatt, and at $49, what you get in the packet is a fairly solid looking IEM. It looks and feels well built, albeit relatively cheap compared to more premium models. The cable's fine, the tips are fine, and so we're going to cut straight to the chase and talk about how it sounds. The biggest issue for me with the OH300 is that the moment you listen to it, it becomes very clear that there's a tonal imbalance somewhere. The upper registers sound a bit thin, like there's a suck out somewhere in the mid-range, and whilst the bass does have excellent weight and punch to it, that doesn't carry through enough into the mid-range registers to really make it make sense all the time, from a tonal point of view. How the OH300 sounds overall to my ears is as an IEM with an emphasis on the upper mid-range into the treble, some bass lift as well, but with a bit of a hole through the mid-range as a result. One benefit of that tuning is that the soundstage, the sense of imaging and separation are all fantastic, and I mean that in the sense that everything's well separated and everything's well placed in space, but it is worth being aware that it's a fairly intimate soundstage. It doesn't really extend outside the head at all, but everything that's going on inside the head feels like it's got plenty of space to operate within. In other words, each sound has space around it, things don't get congested, but it's not up there with some of the very best soundstaging IEMs I've tried. Even if you just spend a little bit more money and get something like the ikko HiFi that I've also reviewed just recently, but just spending a little bit more to get the ikko HiFi, I think nets you a better soundstage experience. Having said that, things aren't all bad with the OH300. As I said, their soundstage and imaging is good despite a slightly more compact space that they work in, and their tonality, whilst not perfectly balanced, is still quite enjoyable. They do have a slight lack of refinement in the overall sound that reminds you from time to time that you're listening to a more budget IEM. But when we put them up against the competition, we start to realise that the OH300 is actually very good. And to explain what I mean by that, I put the OH300s up against another IEM in a similar price category, and one that I consider to be one of the better budget IEMs around, and it's been around for a long time, in the Tin HiFi T2. The T2 comes in at $39, making it $10 cheaper than the OH300, and putting the T2 up against the OH300, it was a very interesting comparison. One of the tracks I listened to was Joliet Bound by Wynton Marsalis and Eric Clapton, and the T2 comes across clean and punchy on this track. Unfortunately though, the treble from the T2 is just a little bit too far forward, and that means that sounds like the tambourine in this track actually become more prominent than things like the guitar and the vocal, which actually throws the mix off. I also found that the vocal in this track wasn't particularly well separated by the T2, and it definitely should be. And then moving down into the bass, it had a decent amount of weight and presence, but I'd describe it as just okay. Then if we go over to the OH300, there was immediately a better sense of space coming out of it. The top end does get a little bit metallic and tinny from the OH300, like there's been emphasis placed in kind of the wrong place in the tuning of them. But having said that, that tambourine I mentioned before from the T2 is now better balanced from the OH300. The guitar and the vocal are able to come forward in the mix because things like the tambourine aren't as emphasised. The bass from the OH300 from the very bottom end up into the mid bass comes across a bit fuller from the OH300. Not because they've actually got more bass, but because there's less treble. That more balanced tonality also helps to separate the vocal from the mix better. And despite saying before that the OH300s aren't always the most refined sounding IEM, they do come across more refined than the T2. And so what I'd say about the OH300s is that they've got a slightly hit and miss overall sound. On some tracks they can sound great, on other tracks where they do have a cut or an emphasis can throw them off a little bit. But if you were to put the T2 and the OH300 in front of me, it's the OH300 that I'd choose. And so I'm going to keep this video fairly short as kind of a micro review and say that if you want a dynamic sounding IEM that's got a bit of energy to it, but it's not fatiguing at all, I think the OH300 could be really good. If you like really forward vocals, it's probably not so good for you. The vocals come across a little bit recessed because of the tuning sometimes. But ultimately, I think the OH300 is a very solid option. As I said before, I'd probably spend just a little bit more on something like the ikko HiFi if you've got the budget to spare. But if you do want to stick to around about the $50 mark, the ikko OH300 could just be a really good choice for you. And so let me wrap this one up here. I hope you found the video useful and helpful if you've been considering the OH300. Hopefully you now know if it's going to suit your tastes. And if this has been useful and helpful, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and ring the notification bell. I've got a bunch more exciting and interesting content coming soon, and I hope you'll be here to check it out with me. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.